Hello, everyone. My name is Charles Walter Buntjer. I was born in 1940 on a farm in northern Illinois. I would like to talk a little bit about what happened to me before I was drafted into the Army. When I was 13 years old in 1953, I was devastated. My mother, who was always protecting me from my father and life in general, I guess, passed away from breast cancer. And for years, I was devastated. My father didn't seem to understand where I was coming from. I wanted to become a commercial artist. I wanted to move to New York City, and he thought I was going to stay on the farm the rest of my life and run it after he retired. Now, 3 years went by, and I guess it was, well, maybe two, in 1956, my father one day said he had met a woman and was going to get married again. Now, my sister and I were shocked because we had no idea how he could meet anyone, let alone some woman who lived in Rice Lake, Wisconsin, 400 miles north of where we lived. She lived in northwestern Wisconsin. She had a daughter that was a year older than I, and she had never been on a farm. She was a private secretary. How could this be? Now, to let you know a little bit what life was like for me with my father, he said one day he was going to go away for 5 days and visit my new stepmother, Rose, and I was alone on the farm. I'm 16. We've got around 30 milk cows, chickens, hogs. He leaves me alone. I had to get up and milk the cows in the morning. It took about 2 hours. And in the evening, I had to clean the barn out. I had to feed the cattle. I had to feed the pigs and the chickens and gather the eggs and all that, which was okay, even though I was really busy for being 16 years old. And one night after I got through milking, I went to the barn around 9:30 to see if everything was all right, and one of the cows was in labor. And she couldn't have the baby. There was something wrong, and I tried to turn it around and pull it out. And I got the legs out, but I could not get it to come out. I tried, and then I finally hooked the tractor up and put a rope around the legs of the calf that were coming out, and I managed to slowly pull it out. But it died, and of course the cow died also. So then I had to, like at 11:30 at night, hook them up to the tractor with a chain and drag them out into the pasture. So my father came back home after 5 days, and the first thing he did was tell me that I was a fool and didn't know up from down, and why didn't I call a veterinarian at 11 o'clock at night instead of trying to take care of it myself. And I thought, well, I don't know who the veterinarian is. I don't know what the phone number is. I'm alone. And that was the way life was with the two of us. I did the best I could, but it was always a put down. Now, my stepmother moved in with her daughter, and she was just wonderful. She was as nice to me as my mother had been. She was a buffer, made sure that I got to do things that I couldn't have done without her being there. And as time went by, my father, I think, got to a point kind of ignored me. When I was 18 and had graduated from high school, Rose got me into Rockford College for a year, where of course I studied the important things in life: French, English, history, and art appreciation. And then one day I got up in the morning to do something, and Rose was in the kitchen and had made breakfast. And then I looked, and she had a suit on, nylons, heels, nice hairdo. I said, "What's going on?" She said, "I have a job in Freeport. It's about 30 miles away. There's about 10,000 people in Freeport." And she said, "I'm going to work for a CEO as a private secretary. She got in her car and off she went. I said, wait a minute, how can this be happening? My stepmother works in town. I said, I don't understand this. So I got out of the first year of college and I'm on the farm. It's summer of 1959 and I'm thinking, I'm going to die on the farm. Where's New York? Where's what the type of work that I would like to do? I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. Well, my stepmother came home one day and she said, I have a job interview for you at a big company in Freeport. So I went and interviewed and nothing happened. So a month went by and I'm in the barn shoveling manure and my stepmother yells out the door, there's a phone call, get in here now. And I diddled around. She said, now. So I rushed in and I answered the phone and a man said, I interviewed you a month ago and we want you to come in Monday and start your job. We'll show you all around and what you need to do. Well, I told my stepmother and she and I just had a trauma. We laughed, we carried on. We were just so happy. And my father came in, it was like 3 o'clock in the afternoon when we always had tea and cookies before doing chores. And he wanted to know why we were all so happy. Chuck has a job in Freeport, the same town that I work at. And my father went like, uh-oh. So in the meantime, I forgot to tell you, when I got out of college, my father figured I was never going to go anywhere but on the farm. So he took me to a little town called Forston of about 1,000 people. And there were two car dealers, a Ford and a Buick. And I wanted that Buick car in the worst way, but I figured he wouldn't buy it for me. And I said, maybe I'll take the Ford. And he said, no, you need the big car. It's all iron and steel and it's heavy. And in the wintertime when it's icy and snow and stuff, you're safer in the big car. So I did get the big car. Wasn't that fabulous? And here's a picture of that car too. Well, after we all got excited about me getting the new job, he was not happy. He bought me a new car, and the next thing is I'm dumping him in the farm, and I'm going to work in Freeport. I get to Freeport the next week, and they said, we're sending you to Chicago to learn how to wire boards and create punch cards and run tabulating machines, IBM tabulating machines. So that's how I got started in the computer industry because of my stepmother. Talk about wonderful. Oh my gosh. So I worked 2 years in Freeport at a large manufacturing company, and then I moved to Rockford. I was still living at home when I was working in Freeport. I moved to Rockford. My sister and her husband lived there and had a big, nice new ranch house on a double lot. And I had an apartment in a huge old house on the river overlooking Rockford. So I started working at this new company. They had built a multi-million-dollar manufacturing plant and a state-of-the-art computer center. And the next thing they said was, you are going to go big places in this company because we think you're wonderful. Well, 2 years went by and I said, boy, I've got it made. I've got a wonderful job. They got big plans for me. The VP thinks I'm wonderful. My sister and I have coffee all the time and gossip away. And I have this nice apartment with a view of the city. I've got my car. I'm all set to go. Well, in the summer of 1959, I come home and there's a letter in the lobby of the house where I lived. I took it upstairs and I opened it up and I said, oh no, you've been drafted. Well, it told me that I needed to shape up. I needed to go to Chicago, and that's where they would put me on a bus and send me off to Fort Knox, Kentucky, where I would go to basic training. So I told my family, and they said, well, you got to do what you have to do. And my boss, who was a VP, had a trauma and said, you are going to have a job when you come back here after 2 years. We are going to make sure that job is open, and we're going to be expecting big things out of you when you get back here. We got big plans for you. He even called my sister every 3 or 4 months for the first year to see that how I was doing in basic training, and then when I was stationed. And my sister would call me up and she'd say, he really is hot to trot as far as getting you back there. And she says, I wonder. And I said, yeah, I wonder too. Time will tell what happens to me after I get out of basic training. So that's an overview of what happened before I was drafted. And now, on to when I was drafted. I went to Chicago, and there they put a bunch of us on a bus to go to Fort Knox, Kentucky. It took about a day to get there, and I was one of the older people that had been drafted. I was 23 and a half years old already, and several of the other people were 22, 23. And many of us had been working already in the business world or manufacturing or whatever. And some of the people were like, I don't know, maybe 18, 19, they joined. And some of them had no idea about anything in the world. I thought I wasn't that sophisticated. Well, I have news for you. We get to Fort Knox, and they put us through the initial review of us, and then they put many of the older ones of us into a barracks. There were 4 barracks there, 2 stories, and I think there were 40 people about on each floor. And the whole area was covered with rocks, so there wasn't really much to do around there as far as cleanup because there weren't any weeds or anything else around there. I was put in the 1st platoon, and there were several other older people that 22, I say older now, but 22, 23. And we were supposed to choose platoon leaders. Well, they instantly wanted me to be a platoon leader, and I said, I'm not going to be a platoon leader. I'm not going to have to try to run around after all these twits. And so 2 of the older guys became the platoon leaders. They were just nice as could be. And the 3 of us became really good friends because they and our sergeant, who was from Tennessee, he was about 5'9", decided that I wasn't going to get away from not being a platoon leader. They made me the guide on, which meant I had to put my pack on my back, even my rifle. Everything was on my back and around my waist, and I had to carry this guide on, which was a staff about, 12 foot long with a banner on the top. So every time we marched any place, I had to be in the front leading everybody, directing where they were going to go, and I was in charge of stepping lively. So that was the first day, and we went to bed, and we were worn out. The next morning we got up, and we were supposed to go for breakfast, but I told everybody and the platoon leaders, I said, we have to put on a good show. We don't want to get in trouble right away. So let's clean this place up. So we scrubbed everything up, made the beds tight so you could bounce a quarter off of them. There were red cans all over that had water in because everybody smoked, so you put them in there so there was no chance of fire. We were proud of ourselves. We go to have breakfast. We go back to the barracks. Our sergeant and a couple of other people came in, and they walked around and said, this is the worst place we've ever seen. They ripped everything apart. All the beds were ripped up. They took the cans with the water and threw them on the floor, and there was water all over. And we just stood there at attention, and our sergeant said, I hope that you people learned a lesson. He said, what a pig pen. He said, shape up or else. And he went out the door. He said, I'll be back in an hour or so. So I and the platoon leaders told the rest of them, they said, keep calm, don't get mad, because they're just doing this to test us. So let's get our act together and put everything together as best we can. So guess what? We scrubbed away, we cleaned away, we put everything up. We stood at attention, and the sergeant came in and he walked around and he goes, and then he says, well, it's not too bad considering. Well, that was a compliment as far as we were concerned. And he said, okay, he said, we're going to go out on the field now and we're going to start marching around. You're going to learn how to march together and all this and that. And we'll be talking about the classes we're going to and all that sort of stuff. And guess what? We were all actually quite happy, because the rest of the 2 months, we never really had a problem with our sergeant, because he knew that he had a couple of older people in charge, and he wasn't going to have to chase us around. As a matter of fact, we did have to laugh, because some of the 18, 19-year-olds from Arkansas or some places really had problems. They didn't know how to tie a tie or anything else like that, so we had to show them how to tie ties and how to get dressed up in their dress uniforms and all that sort of stuff. So it was like, not only were we platoon leaders and the guidon, but we were also kind of like the mothers and fathers to some of the younger ones. So that was our first couple of days in basic training. Now we're going to go on to the next section, which is going to be marching. That was a piece of cake. Now we'd go out in the parade grounds, and there were the 4 barracks. We were in the first platoon, so we were first in line. And then there were all the other barracks and the platoons, and in the back was the airborne group. They were just something unbelievable. Their sergeant was 6 foot plus. He had his clothes all pressed and stuff. He looked like something you see on one of those flyers to make you want to join the Army, especially the airborne, because he was handsome as could be. But all the people in there, in his platoon, were all nuts. They were 18, 19, 20, and they all had attitude, and they hated everybody else, because the rest of us were trash. Because one night, we heard all this screaming, and we looked out the window. They had gotten drunk. I don't know how that happened. And they got up on the second floor or on the roof. I was told the roof, I'm not sure how they got up there. They took sheets and jumped off at 2 a.m, off of the roof, and fell down, of course, onto the rocks. And the next day they were all cut up and bruised. And I don't know if anybody broke anything, but that's what was the airborne. They were just something else. Now, we'd all line up, and, you'd have like 300 people in line, two by two, and we'd be ready to march, and I was the guidon, and our platoon was first, and our platoon leaders, and my sergeant would sidle up, he was from Tennessee, and he was short, and he and the airborne sergeant hated each other, so he'd sidle up, and he'd say, okay, you guys, are you ready to march? And of course the platoon leader said, yes, sir. And then he'd say, okay, Buntjer, are you ready to march? Are you ready to walk it out? Yes, sir. He said, okay. And then ready, march. So the old guidon flag went up, and off we marched. And then my sergeant would say, okay, Buntjer, step it out. So I had long legs, and I could walk hours, and even with all that pack on my back and everything. So off we'd go, and after an hour, he'd say, okay, everybody can stop. We'd stop. He said, 20-minute break. So we had our canteens of water and stuff. Well, the airborne was half a mile back because they were shorter. And of course, they had to keep up with us. And I marched so fast, and they'd get back there, and then they'd throw themselves on the ground and have a drink. But they only got there about 5 minutes, and then my sergeant would say, okay, snap to. We're going to take off again because you already had a 20-minute break. Well, they only had 5 minutes. So, of course, their sergeant was pissed off. But off we'd go. And many times we marched all over when we were going to go to different classes that I'll talk about later on. So one day, a couple of weeks went by, we went out and we were all in line, and our sergeant wasn't there for the first platoon. I wondered what was going on. Well, the sergeant from the airborne came up with the airborne guys, and he said to the first platoon, to the back of the line where you belong. And then he said, you just stay there because you're the guide on. And we said, well, what's going on? He said, well, I guess our sergeant had to take his wife to the hospital for some tests. So off we went, and of course, the airborne sergeant was going to screw the first platoon because they were at the back end now. So he told me to step it up or else. So we're shooting down the road. Oh, and the other thing is that they told us never to veer one way or the other as we were marching, and it was a combat zone. So these tanks would come flying down the road, and they'd come so close to us that our fatigues would, our legs would flap around in the wind and stuff. They were like brushed by us, 100 tons of clanking steel, and you were supposed to just keep marching and like nothing was going on. But anyway, we're marching along, and suddenly, about half an hour went by, I almost tripped and fell because my right heel got caught on something. So we went up farther, and suddenly my left heel got caught, and I almost fell on my face. And I thought, well, this is weird. So I marched up a little farther, and I looked around. Well, those two suckers and the platoon leaders for airborne were sneaking up behind me, and they'd put their toe on the back of my heel, on my boot, and try to trip me. Well, I wasn't going to put up with that, so I shot up about 25 feet and turned around, put the guide on down like this, and it's had a big point on it. And I told those suckers, I said, you want it? I said, come up and get it. And of course, the airborne sergeant came shooting over, and he told me that I was in big trouble. Who did I think I was? And a Jeep came flying up alongside of us, and there was our sergeant sitting in the passenger seat, and he jumped out of the Jeep, and he rushed over, and he told him to get away from me, and he told him at the airport to get back to the line at the back end of the column again, because he said that's where they belonged. And he said if he wanted to cause trouble, they'd go to the first sergeant, then they'd go to the major, and then to the general's office, because he wasn't going to put up with his crap. Well, you should have seen it. Those guys shot to the back, and we got all lined up again, and my sergeant says to me, he said, okay, Buntjer, are you ready to go? I said, yes, sir, and off we went. Now, I do have one funny thing. I'm not sure if I should tell you or not, but one day we're marching along, and I could hear the platoon's leaders talking among themselves, but they weren't supposed to be doing. Chuck, blah, 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 Chuck, blah, blah, blah. And our sergeant's walking along beside him, marching along, and I think, finally I said, okay, you two, what are you talking about? I heard my name. They said, well, we couldn't help but say, we're all wearing these fatigues and they're really crappy. But we've decided that when looking at everybody marching all over, you're the only one that can actually walk and look sexy in fatigues. I said, well, I thought to myself, well, I could take that in a bad way or I can take it as a compliment. So I said, well, thank you very much. That's very nice of you. And of course, they and the sergeant all cracked up, and off we went, marching away. And now we're going to start getting into the serious things. I did want to tell you that we did go to different classes, like how to take a gun apart and how to put it back together again, how to wear a gas mask into a building where that was actually filled with gas and you taking it off and putting it back on again, and doing all kinds of other classes and stuff. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is that was really exciting was marching off to the gun range and learning how to fire rifles. Well, of course, growing up on the farm, I had a rifle already, but that's another very interesting story. Next, I want to talk about the area that I was most interested in and really enjoyed the most. Several times a week we would go to the firing range and we would practice hitting the target. Now, I'm not sure if there's like maybe 25 or 30 of us at a time that would be on the firing range. There would be a long line, we'd be standing there, and in front of us were 3 or 4 sandbags. Then maybe 500 feet or more away were the targets. We were given our rifles, we'd lay down and position ourselves flat on our stomach, hiding behind the sandbags, putting the rifle just on top of the sandbag, and then peering over there to get a glimpse of where the target was. We were told this is because you wanted to make sure that you were away from any bullets that might come flying at you when you were in the infantry and you were in active duty. I said to the trainer, "What kind of a gun is this anyway?" I said, "I had a brand new rifle on the farm that I used to use to go hunting for pheasant." He said, "Well, it's the old M1 from World War II. He said, "You don't need a new rifle or a new gun," because he said, "all you want to do is hit the target. That's what we're here for, target practice." Got it? Yes, sir. So about 25 of us all laid down, and on each side of me was our platoon leaders and or squad leaders, whatever you wanted to call them, that we had become such good friends with. And of course, some of the people had never fired a gun before or a rifle, so they had to teach them how to put in the cartridges and close them up and take off the safety and do this and do that, and how they should hold the rifle, and they should squeeze very easily and not hard the trigger, and so on. So we're lying there, and since I said I'm Buntjer with a B, I'm usually in the first group that does anything. We're lying there, and I start shooting. Well, about 20, 30 minutes goes by, and the guy next to me said, "What do you think you're doing, Buntjer?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean, what do I think I'm doing?" He said, "You're hitting all the targets." I said, "Uh-oh." He said, "Yeah, what happens if you go into combat?" Well, I was aiming the rifle at the target, and suddenly I felt a boot kick the back of my boot. I looked up and was curious as to who's doing that to me. Here was the first sergeant. He was the big black man with a brand new Cadillac. He drove all around the base checking to make sure everybody was following the rules and they were doing the training the way they should be. He's standing behind me like this. "Buntjer." "Yes, sir." "You're not gonna miss any targets, are you?" "No, sir." Bang, bang. So guess what? Out of the 400 people in training, I came in as the top shot of a carbine in the basic training thing. So I was given an award, and actually, when graduation, I was given a small statue. So I really enjoyed being on the firing range, and yes, it's true. I didn't miss any targets. About the 5th or 6th week, toward the end of our basic training, we were told we were going to go into maneuvers as far as being an artillery unit. What did that comprise of? Now, it was interesting. It hadn't rained all the time we were there. They said it hadn't rained for almost 3 months. And where we're going to go for maneuvers, they had ground up the dirt, and it was about maybe 4 inches deep or 5 inches deep, just plowed and sifted. And they had stakes put all around with wires across that were about 2 feet off the ground. They told us we were going to go at night and we were going to get on our hands and knees with our rifles in our hands and crab crawl underneath those wires from one side to the other. Now, the only lights were going to be from the headlights of these Jeeps, and there was supposed to be live bullets flying a couple of feet over top of the wires. They said they were even closer, so not to put your head up if you didn't want to get shot. I don't know if that really was true or not, but we weren't taking any chances. So we get all ready, we get on our hands and knees, then we lay down, ready to crawl like a crab, and it starts to rain. How can this be? Well, that whole area turned into a mass of mud. Then we were told when we got through, we were going to have to clean those rifles. So some of the men had their cigarettes with them, and they were filters. So they looked around, and then they took the filters off and jammed them into the rifle, into the barrel. Because can you imagine crawling around in the mud and getting not only the rifle, but then the inside of the barrel all full of mud? So they were all hot to trot, and they got on their stomach and they went to crab crawl across the mud, and the sergeants and the trainers came over and they said, "Excuse us, what do you think you're doing, huh?" They said, "Take those out or else." Well, so much for that idea. So we all crawled from one end to the other, and when we got to the other end, we were completely covered with mud, and our guns were covered with mud. And then they put us all in trucks and drove us back to the barracks, where we showered and cleaned up, and then we had to sit down and clean our rifles, oil them, put them back together again. So that was the exciting time that we had on the maneuvers and the firing range. Once was enough. We didn't need to do that again. Now I want to talk about what was going on for about 4 or 5 weeks during basic training. It involved me and the first sergeant and everybody else of importance that was in Fort Knox. We'd be out training, and suddenly this big black sergeant would come in his new Cadillac, and he'd stop and he'd go, "Buntjer." And I'd go over and we'd get in the car and off we go, and everybody'd say, "What's going on with Buntjer? Why is he being picked up a couple times a week and driven around?" Well, I go to majors, I go to generals, I go here, I go there, I'd be interviewed and stuff. And because I was top shot, I was in the top 10 across country, and I had the highest IQ out of 400 people. They wanted me to go into officer training and become a second lieutenant. So I was all excited about that. And I don't know, I was thinking, well, 20 years, I'd be, 45 years old, I'd have a pension, I'd have standing in the military, I'd have probably medical care, and then I could go out and do some other type of work. So I wasn't really sure if I should, sign up and become a second lieutenant, go to officers training, or if I should just go with the flow. Now, about a week and a half before we were going to graduate, I was picked up for the last time and went to this general's office. And I'm sitting in there, and the same thing happens, but this time with the general secretary. He says, "Buntjer, come here." Oh, okay. He says, "You're 23 and a half years old. You've been in the computer business for 4 years." He said, "I don't think you'd function very well as a second lieutenant." He said, "You're at the bottom of the totem pole. You'll be screwed over by everybody and their mother." And he told me some of the things they do to second lieutenants. And not only that, but he said, "Who knows in the future where you might end up, because you're in the infantry right now, and that's where you're being trained." So he said, "I know where you're going after basic." He said, "You can't tell anyone, because we'll be court-martialed if you do." So I'm going to tell you, and you then decide what you want to do. So he told me what I was going to be doing after basic training and where I was going to be stationed. So I smiled, and he said, and what do you think? And I went, I don't know anything. So that was the end of the 8 weeks. And now we'll find out what happened when we had graduation. But there was something else that did happen before that. It was almost the last week, and they decided that we were going to have a 2-day weekend off because we hadn't had any time off in 5 weeks. So 3 of us, the 2 platoon leaders and I, got together and decided to go to Fort Knox and, see what was going on, maybe have a nice dinner, do this and that. Well, the rest of the troops were all up in arms. They said, oh, you're going to go to a whorehouse, or you're going to go to a stripper club, or you're going to do this, you're going to do that, and we're going to be here. Well, the 3 of us went off to Fort Knox, and we went around to see what was going on, and we had to laugh because we weren't really interested in going to a whorehouse or anything. So what did we do? We saw the grand opening of Cleopatra, of all things, the 3-hour extravaganza. So we said, well, I think we'll have a nice dinner, then we will go there and sit and relax and have a good time, and then we'll stay overnight at a hotel, then go back to the camp the next day on Sunday. So we get back to the camp, and everybody's all excited, and they said, how did you do? What did you do? Oh, we went to see Cleopatra. I'm sorry, but so much for that, so much for being a big bunch of butchy men and whoring around the city. Here we were having cocktails and then going to see Cleopatra. Couldn't help but laugh about that. Now it was time for graduation. All 400 of us stood in front of the barracks, all at attention, and the sergeants and the majors and the generals and whomever else were all standing up there in a line behind a table with a tent over them. And they started talking about what a great group we were, and we were graduating, and on and on and on. And then they wanted to give awards out, and they said, well, there were 7 awards, and 5 of the 7 were from the 1st platoon. They called my name up, and I went up and I said, oh, thank you. I was going to give an Academy Award thing because they gave me the statue, the little statue. And top shot out of 400, and you've won this award. Thank you, sir. Then the cross country was one of the platoon leaders. He went up and got an award. The other one got an award. Somebody else got an award. Somebody else got an award in our 1st platoon. And then there were 2 left, and I don't know who got those, but can you imagine that 5 out of the 7 were from our platoon? Just unbelievable. Then they had us all stand outside, and they said, we're going to call names off now, and then you go off on a side, the group together. So they named off about 40 or 40 maybe, and most of them were from the 1st platoon, and they had them on the side together, and they said, you're going to Fort Benning, Georgia to learn how to fight in the swamp. Oh no. 30 here, 40 here, 20 here, 10 here. And then about 10 or 15 from the airborne were put on one group, but they were going to go to the Air Force Academy, which was a plum place to be placed. So they got all through, and after they had called everybody's name, they were all in groups all over. There was only one person left, standing alone in the middle, me. Well, everybody, especially the 1st platoon, said, why is Buntjer standing there all alone? What's going on? So the generals looked at each other and the majors, and they all laughed, and they said, oh, We have one person left, Buntjer. Buntjer, did you know where you were going? Buntjer, me. Don't know anything. Well, everybody said, what's going on with him? Well, guess what? The generals looked at each other and they said, okay, Buntjer's going to San Francisco. He's going to work at the computer center at the Presidio. That is the best job in the military. He said, everybody who's retiring at the end of their 20 or 30 years, generals, majors, anybody, it doesn't matter. They go there, they live in nice houses up in the hills overlooking the city and the Golden Gate Bridge and the bay and the ocean. It's the place to go. And Buntjer's going there. And I smiled. Thank you, sir. Well, the rest of the troops were not amused, especially the first platoon. They never talked to me again. Months later, I asked my stepmother what was going on. Why didn't anybody talk to me? And she said she talked to their parents and mothers, and they hated me. They said, I got a special thing because I was white, whatever. And she said, no, it's because he's in the computer industry, and that's why he got that job. So after basic training, I flew back to Rockford, and I stayed with my sister for a few days, and then I visited my parents on the farm. And then I went to Chicago and got on a United Airlines flight. And off I flew to the Presidio, the computer center, just a mile from the Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz, Angel Island, Sausalito, and a view of downtown San Francisco. Such a deal. What else could I have asked for? Nothing. So the next part, which will be part 2, is what happened while I was stationed at the Presidio of San Francisco. Lots of stories to tell, just like I did in basic training. I hope you enjoyed this talk about basic training in Fort Knox, Kentucky.